Hi, everyone. This is Arry, Chair of the Cascadia Blockchain Council and your host on Windshield Time and the Blockchain Underground. Today, we had a really great guest, John Devadoss from MGD Studios. He is also a board member of the Interwork Alliance and the Global Business Blockchain Council. He's just a great entrepreneur and a great speaker, and he told us a lot about stuff. So we talked about dev tools, we talked about platforms, we talked about incentive structures, passive versus active stacks. We talked about what we should do in the world of development and how developers should start getting involved in the space. We talked about the CBDCs. We talked about economic institutions, lots of different topics. I really hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I learned so much, as I do every time I get to talk to John Devadoss. And we have these every Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. PST. Just sign up on meetup.com under Blockchain Underground, and I hope you'll join us one of these Fridays, 12 to 1. Thanks. Together we rise. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, John, for joining us for another AMA. It's so awesome to see you. And I always learn so much whenever we get to chat. For folks that don't know you and want to get to know you, would you give a quick introduction of yourself, kind of long form? Like, how did you get into the space? What's your background? What are you working on now? And how do you hope to change the world?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Again, truly a privilege to be here, and want to make it very interactive. So please, questions back and forth. I'll take just a few minutes. I don't want to take up all the time. I guess in terms of what I do currently, I serve on the governing board of the Global Blockchain Business Council based in DC and Davos, primarily working with both profit and non-profit sectors, governments, central banks, major industries, with respect to standards, open standards for blockchains and blockchain interoperability. Why do I do this? Many years ago, I used to work at Microsoft on platforms, and I had the privilege of working on web services and standards for web services. So I have seen the impact, the importance of open standards and schemas, and I want to do my bit for the blockchain domain based on what I learned at that time. I also build developer platforms and tools. In fact, my team and I, we build the dev stack for the Neo blockchain. We've been working on this for a couple of years. The motivation for this is I spent close to 18 years working on developer tools at Microsoft on .NET before it was called .NET, on Azure before it was called Azure. And my thesis is that a number of the early blockchains, unfortunately, were misguided in trying to invent and reinvent new languages and new tools. Whereas my view is that there are 20+ million developers worldwide. And when we build platforms and tools, we should go to where they are as opposed to making them come to us, which means that building a smart contract ought to be as simple, as straightforward as building an Azure function or an AWS Lambda, which is what we have done for the N3 blockchain. So that's the key part of my motivation in terms of the developer space. I also was a co-founder of the Interwork Alliance 2 years ago, again, with the mission of working together collaboratively with major players like Microsoft, IBM, Accenture, NASDAQ, and others, to once again, have open schemas, protocols to make sure that chains, ledgers, stacks, platforms, whatever you call them, are able to work together. My motivation for this particular domain is, again, going back to platforms. I spent, like I said, close to 25 years working on platforms. I've seen many platforms, mainframes, PCs, client server, the web, SOA, Web 2, and so on. But I've never seen a platform like the blockchain stack. And I explain why. Every previous wave of platform technology is passive, inert plumbing. It's infrastructure. and you can build apps on top of infrastructure. However, the blockchain stack is not passive, inert. It's a very active stack because you have economic protocols, crypto economic protocols baked in intrinsically into the platform. And this is why, you're able to, for example, build a Bitcoin. Think about it, Zoom is an application. Bitcoin, is it an application? Not really, because Bitcoin is an institution. It's self-governing. That's the key difference. With all previous waves of platforms, you build applications. With blockchains, you build institutions. And that's what drove me and motivated me. It took me a while to grok that, by the way. I did not get this initially. And it's because I spent so much time working on platforms, I was able to make that transition and say, whoa, this is a big deal. This is going to change the socio-economic impact of what we can do here, significant. And that's really my motivation with respect to working in this space. And let me pause right there. I don't want to beat the drum too much, but
I think, the things that you eloquently said actually are loaded with a lot of nuances and conceptual ideas that if you haven't thought about it for a long time, it's going to be hard for a lot of people to get right away. I mean, just the idea of like economic protocols are built into blockchain, or that blockchains are used to build institutions. Can we like double click on that and expand a little more? Like, what do you mean by institutions? What do you mean by economic protocols? What does that mean?
absolutely. I'm very happy to. Thank you for the question. So let me again, we can ignore all of the previous waves of platforms. Just look at cloud, for example, cloud platforms.
Okay.
When we build on cloud platforms, and by the way, I was part of the early team. We worked on the incubation of Azure long before it was called Azure. So when you look at a cloud platform, you build applications. And applications, they start when you start them, they stop when you stop them. You think about topics like compliance. How do you ensure compliance? It's an overlay. You bring people, consultants, processes. You think about governance. How do you ensure the governance of a certain application? For example, you may have, let's say, Salesforce CRM, right? How do you ensure the governance? You may have big consulting firms, again, processes, documentation, checks, balances, all kinds of overlay. When I say overlay, what I mean is it's not part of the application. It's something you add on. It's something you bring subsequently to the application. Now, in contrast, again, let's go back, for example, and look at the Bitcoin, obviously, Satoshi's, magnum opus, right? You look at Bitcoin, you don't have the ability to start or stop, right? It's running, it's on, it's been running, and it will run. But more importantly, you look at the governance of the Bitcoin institution. It's self-governing, right? The rules, the constraints, the limitations, they're all baked inside. They're built into the code. And the reason I call this an institution is because unlike an application, you don't have any overlays. There is no consultant out there saying, I'm going to ensure the compliance of the Bitcoin protocol. We look at it, it's running, the protocols are there. There is no external agency or entity or a group of people saying, I'm going to govern Bitcoin. It doesn't happen. There is no need to. And that's the fundamental shift when we think of, right? And this is why so much of the old school, and I'm sorry to say old school, I don't want to be pejorative, but much of the traditional IT or even mainstream IT struggles to make the transition because they are so used to traditional platforms, passive platforms, inert platforms. And so when they look at a blockchain stack, mostly they see a database and they see perhaps a database that is decentralized. Now, to your question, Arry, when I say we have economic protocols baked in, what I mean is you have incentives, you have penalties essentially baked into the protocol. So obviously, for example, when you're mining, again, back to Bitcoin, right? There are incentives to mining. There are obviously penalties, all sort of written into the code, if you will, right? Those are economic incentives. Never in the history of computing have we had a platform where economic incentives were baked inside. Never. And this is what makes it so challenging when you compare and contrast IT of 10 years ago to how does IT, how does the enterprise, how does mainstream IT use blockchain technology? And at best, when they see a database or even a decentralized database, at best, they see half the coin. Now, of course, those of us on the other side, from a consumer perspective, you look at perhaps the coin or the currency and so on, we see the other half, which is this is an economic institution. It so happens to be a platform as well. For example, with Bitcoin, with Taproot and Lightning, you have a platform built. It's maybe not as expansive as the second wave of blockchain platforms, but however, it's still a platform, right? And that's what I mean. And I can talk for a long time, but fundamentally, this notion that we are not building apps anymore. We are truly building institutions. And that's why I would say there is perhaps so much, trepidation and concern and perhaps some level of fear and anticipation on the part of the existing institutions, right, in the government and central banks, and they see and say, look, this is not just an app, right? So this is why there is so much of perhaps pushback and concern and trepidation and some angst as well with respect to how they see it. So all said and done, that shift is really what I would like to emphasize. And what does it mean to build these institutions? As a developer, having been in the dev space for decades, for me, the notion is that it should not be any different from building an app. You're a developer, you build an app, you ought to be able to build an institution. And that's what we have done. What I've done in terms of the scaffolding, the rails, if you will, to enable developers to come in and apply the patterns to quickly, in a couple of minutes, build a smart contract, right? That's kind of the mindset I'm bringing in. I want to give again, not to take too much time, but we used to have this mental model for development many years ago. And I was at Microsoft, and we said, most of us, we live in the Northwest, we hike, right? We hike a lot, we climb. You plan for it. You may have a compass, you have supplies. If you have a multi-day hike, and there is a bit of work involved, right? It's a bit of a grind sometimes, and eventually, you work your way to the top, to the peak. On the other hand, and again, living in the Northwest, I'm sure most of us ski, right? When you ski downhill, you don't have a compass. You're not taking any supplies. It's not a grind. It just happens. You sort of in the flow. You start, and then you're in the flow, and basically you go to your destination. That's what development ought to be. It shouldn't be like hiking uphill with a compass and tools and supplies and planning and all that. It has to be as graceful, right? As elegant, as much fun as skiing downhill. And that's what I've always done in my career in terms of building tools for developers. And this is what I believe as an industry, the things we have done for N3, but looking across the broader blockchain space, I think there is so much to do for the industry to make this a fun, productive, enjoyable experience for developers, professionals, and new developers who are coming on board to build tomorrow's institutions.
You speak so eloquently. I really, really enjoy the way you draw the picture and make it so I don't know. It feels aspirational, but it feels like it's a good aspiration that we should all be heading towards in the way you describe it. These institutions, skiing, not hiking. Hey, Randy, you have a hand up. Want to ask a question?
Yeah, and I think
and introduce yourself too.
Oh yeah, so Randy Calpe. Actually, let me turn on my camera here. Oops. Hey, John. Sorry. Nice to meet you. Yeah, so I've been in the space since 2017, and I think like all others, when I came, it was just the number go up, but then as I learned about it, really just not sell and DC my way through. So it's definitely an area where I'm very passionate about, and just the innovation and like the chat. when I talk to new people in this space, I like to put at least parallels too. And I think that's somewhat the challenge, is that we naturally want to put parallels to what we know today. But then you're, like you said, this is something that's totally different that we were introducing. And so if I were to at least make an effort to make that parallel, would you say like Bitcoin is the TCP/IP, institutions, the Lightning Network, so that's sort of the platform, and then you have the apps that are building, like Strike, that will build on top of Lightning would be the application. So we're basically, the institutions are, whether it's the financial rail that's going on, there's smart contracts that are built, platforms are being built. Is that a fair parallel to make it to what we know today? As close to it?
Certainly, Randy. First of all, very good to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for the question. Yes, I think your point is spot on. There is a fair comparison to say perhaps something like Lightning, is perhaps, you could an analog to TCP/IP in terms of the core infrastructure. Absolutely. The only thing I might add would be, again, back to my earlier point about the economic protocols, the economic incentives, right? TCP/IP, HTTP, UDP, you go back, all of those fundamental underlying protocols, they do not have any notion of economic incentives or penalties, right? And so they do what they do very well, which is, I guess you could say, comparable to Lightning. But I think the critical piece, at least in my humble opinion, the critical piece that really that Satoshi did truly change the industry, was to embed economic, because incentives matter. We all know that, right? That's what, I think we're all at a point in our careers where we know that's the truth, whether we like it or not. And to be able to have a fabric that embeds incentives, constraints, penalties, in a way that it is impervious to outside influence, right? That's the key. Because you can embed incentives, penalties, and so on into a stack. However, how do you ensure that that's impervious, that is immutable, that cannot be, as we said, manipulated, right? That's the magic in terms of a fundamental mind shift. But you're right about the TCP/IP and the Lightning in terms of the comparison. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Arry, you had sorry, go ahead. Was it? Yes, you had a question earlier about in terms of development and perhaps where to start or where to. I want to, maybe if I could add a couple of comments there.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Yes. The thing that I would always recommend, yes, writing code, obviously there's a lot of focus on development and, and building and building, right, and so on. But for me, being able to read code is equally, if not more important, because to be able to understand the design, to learn, to build on the shoulders of the giants who've built, obviously Bitcoin and other similar, right? That to me is the critical piece. I would say for many of us, sometimes, we go to the point of saying, I'm going to write some code, and then yes, it's a lot of effort and startup and, and friction and time and so on, right? I would strongly recommend, I feel like this is something we ignore as an industry, as a community, we kind of really ignore, which is a shame as far as I'm concerned, is, being able to read code, to understand, to learn, is absolutely important, right? Just go to GitHub, just poke around, fork it, right? Clone it. And once you have that sense, then, you can understand, you have the mental model. And sometimes I think that's actually more important than writing code, because when you write code, you know what you want to do, you know what you want to get done. But to get there, you have to really have in your mind, right, a mental model of picture of what is possible. And to me, that comes from being able to read and to look at code, right? And to look at the patterns, what are the recurring design patterns? What are the anti-patterns, right? How did Satoshi do this? And how did, this person, write this? There's so much fun there. And I feel like this is underappreciated. And certainly, I don't know how to say it politely, but we just ignore it, which is a huge loss in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I think originally when we were talking about building that curriculum that we built for the Coding Dojo, you were really stressing at, I don't want to focus just on coding, but people really need to learn and think about algorithms and noticing patterns and things of that sort. So I remember that very clearly.
Yes, yes, you're right. We did talk about, yes,
Yeah.
very vividly. I agree, because I feel like sometimes we sort of overemphasize this aspect of writing code and look, again, I got to be very careful. I got to be very politically correct. But writing code is just writing code. But being able to read and understand the code and then think about the possibility, what you want to do, that's actually the meta aspect, right? So in some sense, that's even more critical, even more important than actually the production or the writing of code. And this is just my opinion. And I want to be careful. I don't want to upset anybody on the call, but I want to just share my perspective.
So then, like, as you have this company that builds dev tools, or you're hiring people to come work in the space in the name of blockchain, what are like some key interview questions or tests or ways that you figure out, does this person have the fundamentals or understanding to be able to think in this white space, or they might not be ready for it? Like, what do you do? How do you find that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking the question. So for me, there are two things, right? One is, of course, you have kind of the core skill set in terms of understanding, like I said, algorithms, being able to read, being able to, to manipulate the code, if you will. That's just the sort of the underlying fundamentals.
Mhm.
The more interesting thing is the understanding of the possibilities of this new platform. That's the hard bit that I find a good number of people do not appreciate. And then, you end up writing apps on blockchain. And as I've said earlier, building apps on blockchain in some sense is a travesty, I think, right? Because you're kind of taking something that's a fundamentally different platform, but still building, with the older abstractions or 10 years ago's abstractions. And so that's the piece I would recommend. I would urge people to spend some time and say, what is different about what we are building, what I'm building, why, right? And that's not easy, to be able to internalize. It's something I think each of us have to sort of experience for ourselves, right? It's a bit of a journey. That's the piece that, frankly, has been more challenging for us in talking to people around what we want to build. And here is why.
Mm.
My philosophy in building a team, philosophy is a big word, maybe, I don't know. My approach in building a team, in collecting people, is that, we spend so much time on the why, right? Why are we doing this? Why? Why does it matter? Right? And then when we agree on the why, the how becomes very much just we just do it, we make it happen, right? And that's why for me the why is so critical, because we stay out of the how. We just leave people alone. People are autonomous. People do, obviously what in terms of getting to the final goal. So the why is this platform different? Of course, the way we build the tools, that, for example, the testing frameworks, right? Security, those concerns still are the same, right? But however, what we are building and why we are building this, I think, is fundamentally different. And that is something, I don't see being taught in terms of course, you have your workshops and your courses, but the traditional, right, in terms of colleges, universities, they talk about the bits and bytes, but not necessarily the way you approach it in the perspective of why does it matter, right? That I feel like is the perhaps the more challenging aspect in terms of talking to people, in terms of bringing people on board, hiring, and so on.
Yeah. Understanding the conceptual why and the ethos and the theories that started the space are important for us to grow from. And even developers and engineers, or maybe you would say especially developers and engineers who are
Yes.
architecting the scaffolding and infrastructure of the future, need to understand the why. Looks like Ray has a hand up. Ray, want to come on video and do a quick intro of yourself and then ask your question?
Sure. I haven't set the camera up.
No worries today. Go ahead.
Yeah,
No worries.
I didn't set for today. Let me see. So the quick intro is I'm working extensively, full-time, 15-hour days, decentralized finance, looking at everything from arbitrage, trading, and liquidation kind of stuff, and writing my own code to do that. So I have been reading lots and lots of arbitrage code, flash loan code, and liquidation code, smart contract code. So, and then I myself, over the last 20 years, have spent thousands of hours programming traditional websites. So everything from ASP to PHP to MySQL, Java, and of course HTML. I've done that extensively. So part of what you were saying, I think I like the way you're speaking, the languaging you're using, but it was interesting. And I'm wondering are you speaking to developers or just general public? Because I've heard that before, a little bit of what you said, and I just wanted to get clarity. The average person who gets on an airplane doesn't need to know how the FAA operates. They don't need to know how an airplane operates, how an airport operates, and what makes that plane take off. They don't need to know any of that. They just know, I got on the plane, I got to where I needed to go, and that's it. But as a developer, because I've owned my own businesses and I've created, just like you, I've created websites from scratch, from vision, from concept. And I've lived that experience of knowing that I got an idea, I know it's possible, now let's figure out how to make it happen. And so from a producer's point of view, owner's point of view, when you're dealing with decentralized smart contracts, I get and agree with, it is important if you're in that space versus somebody who's just getting on the plane. We're developers to indeed learn, which is what I'm now doing, learn and understand what the functions are, what the capabilities of the functions are, and really read that, and then be able to say, gee, I wonder what function would be required to make it do this. How could I make that smart contract do this and do that? So rather than knowing every line of code within the function, at least know that there are functions that are capable of doing that, then just grab that, copy and paste it, you got it going. So I know I covered a few areas there, but go ahead.
No, absolutely. No, I'm very glad. And again, very good to meet you, Ray. And perhaps people here, I might meet you in person in the Seattle area sometime soon. Yes, your last point, I completely agree. And I could not have said it better in terms of the comprehension, the understanding of which piece, which module, which block, right, to use and to reuse. And sometimes we don't necessarily have to understand in great detail as long as we have the comprehension from reading the code at a high level. Yes. And by the way, you're working in the DeFi space, which is the happening space. So I'm very glad to hear that. I think it's so much more.
That's what I said in our last conversation that I had here, was that NFTs are great, they're sexy, and everybody thinks it's wonderful. There's celebrities there. Oh, isn't that exciting? But the real world is in the DeFi, and it's in spot. That's where the money is. It's in the billions, you know. And so, yeah, I'm more interested in this DeFi area, and then creating effectively a money machine. I won't get into the details, but there's a way to basically create a rather voluminous money machine using the DeFi and the smart contracts.
Fascinating. And I agree with you. You're right. This is going to be huge. We haven't seen anything yet, in my humble opinion, yet in the DeFi space. So not
even close. And you said something I'd like to. I didn't mean to cut you off, but you said something else which I'd like to say. I love the way you worded it, because within this space, DeFi, smart contract, you have a capability that brings in the financial side of this that was never there in JavaScript, right? So if you have the average everyday website, sure, you can interact with filling out a form, submitting, and what have you, and a shopping cart requires some of that stuff, but never a smart contract that can look for, sniff out trading options, trading opportunities. And you can have 20 of these bots running at the same time, sniffing out all these opportunities on multiple exchanges. That has never existed.
Absolutely, Ray. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you said it that way. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
This is the and that perspective, I think, is then we get excited, right? I feel like this is the only thing I want to do for the rest of my life.
That's it. That's it. I'm jumping up and down like you wouldn't believe. I like can't even contain myself because I have literally been studying these other contracts that are responsible for successful trades. And so I'm looking, just like what you said earlier, I mean, these are like anywhere between 3 to 12 page contracts, right? You know what, right? So 3 to 12 page, and within each one of those pages, there's multiple clips of functions within, right? So it's a lot of information. But to go through all that stuff and then realize what is possible here is just mind-boggling.
Oh, you said it very well. Absolutely. Incredible stuff, right? What a time to be alive and building these kinds of institutions.
You got it. What a time to be alive. And I'm so glad that I had thousands of hours of programming in the past. It's made it a lot easier. So as I'm reading a smart contract and I see the various functions within it, I already have an awareness, even though I don't know what every line is doing. I don't think I need to know that, but I do need to know that function. I need to know, oh, look, there's a function that's usable, and that's something that needs to be here. And then I wonder if I could get another function to make it do this. Where do I go to find that? So I know a couple of sources, you know, like GitHub and a bunch of other places where you can go and type in and say, ooh, if I could just find this function, oh, there it is right there. Grab it, copy and paste it.
Absolutely. No, in fact, we should have you do a AMA on your experience at some point, I think, with respect to this, because you're right. Right. And this is something I really wish that we would go and perhaps, you know, share with more people, which is just look at the code, just try to read it, start slowly. And that will give you, you know, tremendous amount of power. Right. With respect to what it is you want to build. So anyway, you know, you got me going. So let me pause.
Well, I guess, go ahead, Ray.
Well, I'm as excited genuinely as I can be about this. And what you just said is true, is that when I first dove into this part of it, it was a black hole. I had no idea what was there, what I was going to find. But what I was reading is articles about like DeFi and a couple of others that are about Binance, that are doing billions of dollars on a daily basis. So I knew there's a lot of money here. And then to begin that process of understanding the compilers, ooh, there's compilers here. Instead of other programs to create websites, we have compilers here. That's interesting. That's how we launch codes, you know, launch contracts, and how we build contracts. We do it with a compiler. That's nice. So we got new words. But then as I began to read the different contracts, it was the same thing. It was a black hole. I had no idea. And as I kept reading, I said, oh, now I know what that function's doing. That's interesting. And then you just keep going, and it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer. And then, like anything else in life, now I'm in control. And when I could crank out a website and literally, and that's not an exaggeration, within a couple of hours, a basic, simple 5 or 6 page website, few hours, I'm done. Bam, bam, bam. It's so basic. I wanted to accomplish the same thing with the smart contracts and the DeFi for the space that I'm interested in, that I crank these things out very rapidly and get them to do exactly what I want them to do.
So then that brings me to a question. Can I interject there? Like for a guy like Ray, is he using dev tools that you would build, or what are the dev tools that you built the dev tools on Neo, but are those same dev tools available to use on like Ethereum or Bitcoin or Solana or like these other blockchains? How does that work? I'm not technical as you. Yeah.
Well, no, you certainly are. But I'll respond to your question. Yes. The tools. So we build tools. Yes, for the N3, we build tools that are used by Microsoft. We build tools that are used by the Global Blockchain Business Council, and the broad base of all the way from central banks, you know, exchanges, and the big mega corporations like IBM, Accenture, and so on and so forth. Yes. So in terms of starting, certainly I would say, you know, if you come from perhaps a much more traditional developer perspective of perhaps JavaScript or a C#, certainly, give the blockchain dev toolkit a spin. I think you'll find it very natural. You don't necessarily have to deploy to a main net or a public. We have built private net experiences, so you can basically sandbox, on your PC or Mac, right? Have your own sandbox and then go through the full cycle. There's something called it's called the dev inner loop. And then those of you who are familiar with it, you know what I'm saying. But the dev inner loop is this cycle, right? Of you write some code, you test it, you debug it, you test it, and then you deploy it, right? That's kind of this inner loop. And so for me, the tools that we have built thus far and we are building, very much focus on optimizing this dev inner loop, which makes it very friendly, right? In terms of errors, mistakes, or God forbid, bugs, right? Being able to very quickly iterate through. So much more friendly in terms of, let me start something, and then let me very simple, basic smart contract, right? Let me test it, let me deploy it. In about 3-4 minutes, you could do it with the dev toolkit we have built, for example, right? So I would say, yeah, don't let it stop you. When you start, don't necessarily think about the main net or the public chain. It doesn't matter at this point, right? Use the private net. Go through the dev inner loop, build a few smart contracts, test it. It's very friendly. And because of the perspective we have taken to optimize the dev inner loop, you don't have to worry about, am I going to make an error or a mistake? Am I going to, break something? No, because, you can loop through, you can roll it back. For example, one of the things that the innovations, that's a big word perhaps, but when I began working on the dev tools for blockchains about 2 years ago, debugging smart contracts didn't exist. It reminded me of back in the 90s, when you had to have a print statement. And so you could check and see what was happening and where every variable was and what was the function state before you got in and after you left the function, right? You had to do printfs. And we've built at this point, very happy collectively, very proud of it, that we've probably built the best debugger in the entire industry. And so far as there's something called time travel debugging. You can debug, obviously, moving forward. You can say, I've built this smart contract, I'm going to run this. There was an error. How do I debug it? We have what we call time travel debugging based on work I was doing at Microsoft previously, which is you can go back in time. And because oftentimes the errors in a smart contract are not necessarily errors due to me or my code. It is the conjunction of my code and other code, other smart contracts across, right, that creates this error. So being able to go back in time and say, which other smart contracts were running previously and who was running at the same time as my smart contract, and what was the state, 5 minutes ago or 50 minutes ago. Being able to go back and then play it forward is critical, right? And the reason why we have spent so much time on this is when the dev inner loop and the debugging cycle, going back in time, going forward in time, right? When you have a professional experience that you can trust, then you have more liberty, more room, more freedom, to try, to break, right? To create some bugs intentionally, to write perhaps, faulty code, because the system, the scaffolding gives you that room to play, right? Knowing very well that you can always get back to a steady state, a secure, right, steady state. And so I would say, give it a spin, try the debugger, play with the tools, give me feedback. I'm very happy to what you find, what you would like to see. But I would say that's the key, right? Just get the toolkit. It's on GitHub. It's on the VS Code Marketplace. Use a private net, just play with it, try the debugging. And again, for me, it's the scaffolding, it's the security, right? Because I want development ought to be like downhill skiing. If it's not, there's something wrong with the tools, right?
Interesting. So then, can I go back to another point that you brought up earlier, which was most developers are coming from the infrastructure, plumbing, passive route, and blockchain is different because it's active. It's an active stack. So because most engineers and developers are coming from the technology end and they don't really understand the economic institution part of it. What's the best way for a typical technologist, developer, engineer to learn quickly what economic institution means and just economics in general?
Wonderful question. And maybe, in fact, we should write something together, Arry, on this topic. I think it'll be a good one to publish an article, right?
Okay.
I think it's a wonderful question. So thank you. And I hadn't thought about this, but I would say a couple of things. Firstly, to try to understand what is it that is the Bitcoin architecture, for example, right? What is the architecture? And truly to look beyond, how it's operational, but look at the governance, the self-governance, right? The halving, the incentive model, and that lead to the second point, which is the incentives. How are incentives written intrinsically, right? Baked into the Bitcoin code base, and then think about how would I have done this perhaps on Azure or on a PC, right? Or on web services? Could I even have done it like like I think Ray was saying right earlier? This is things that we could not actually, with the ASP.NET or a PHP MySQL, right? That contrast, I think, would be the way I would recommend to look and say, okay, what is it that's different? Otherwise, for us, a key challenge, that people like me, and I'm one of the mainstream IT guys who came from the traditional space, a challenge for people like me is that I think after spending 15 years, I know everything about platforms. And I think I have understood enough. So I'm saying, okay, just re-platform. This is the word often used, re-platform, right? We re-platform web apps to cloud, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing about blockchain is you cannot re-platform. If you want to take something you have and say, I'm going to re-platform on blockchain, fundamentally flawed, right? And I apologize for being very direct about this. You cannot re-platform. And even if you do, in some sense, you're just kidding yourself that you're using blockchain technology, right? And that's the key. Step back and say, don't think about re-platforming. Think, how would I do this all over again? And that's the key. And this is why many large enterprises, organizations, I talk to them and they say, oh, John, we tried this proof of concept and we didn't see anything happen, right? Yeah. And when you look and you say, okay, you took an existing cloud app and you made it run on a ledger. So there's no aha. Right? Yeah. It doesn't do anything. Why? Because you haven't thought through the economic architecture.
Actually, it's also to the point of like start with Bitcoin and learn about the architecture and the incentive models that are built in there, because Bitcoin is literally the best showcase of how blockchain is supposed to be built with the intrinsic economic institution built in. It's literally the art form, the capital THE, of how this should work. Ideally.
Brilliant summary. Yes. Beautifully summarized. Yes. And I would say, for software people like myself, right? Yeah. We always think about the software architecture, but I didn't think about the economic architecture.
Okay, got it. Right. I know, Ray, you have a question, but we also have only 14 minutes, and I also have a question. How fast is yours? Go, Ray.
I was going to ask one, re-platform. What does that mean? And then I was very excited to hear that you personally, John, were involved in the programming for these. I just went blank. To find the debuggers. Yes. You're one of the guys actually involved in the debugging programs themselves. I think that's exciting, because that's what you just described is what I'm eager to start doing. I'm using for now Remix. And Remix, of course, has a whole bunch of debugging things that are there. You just have to activate them, right? There's a ton of those there. I'm assuming maybe you were involved in a few of those. But I know that eventually I'll probably move to something like maybe Brownie, Truffle, or Zeppelin, move into one of those platforms eventually. But for now, I'm staying with the Remix. So I just wanted to confirm with you that I'm excited about that. And the idea that you can experiment and say, okay, well, let's see how this works, see if there's any errors. Can I deploy? Do we have any problems with this thing? But then when you said re-platform, I'm wondering, one of the things that's different here than was in normal website building, I could experiment with anything on a page on a basic website. And I had a data, most of my sites were database driven, by the way. So I had a lot of stuff going on, but I could say, okay, let's try it. And I FTP it up, take a look at it. It's nice, or nope, got to change that. In smart contracts, if you deploy, it's there. There's no changing. Now it's go ahead and make the change, but now it's a newly deployed contract. And then, well, that didn't work, or I want to modify that. Okay, I make the changes. Now I'm deploying yet another contract. When you said platform, that thing you just talked about, and I just went blank on the word you used. What is that?
Re-platforming was the word.
Yeah, what does re-platforming mean?
Yes, so excellent question. I know there are many perspectives. I'll just pick two perspectives there, Ray. One is with respect to, as you said, once you deploy, it's done, it's there, right? You're absolutely right, which is why I suggest that for the dev inner loop, use a private net, right? Use your own private net or multiple private nets, and then work on the forward and backward. So for example, when I speak about time travel debugging, being able to roll it back, which you obviously cannot do on a public ledger or a public chain, right?
So are you referring to test nets?
Yes, test nets.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and that's what I
say private net is private is basically for me or a very small group of developers. Test net can sometimes still be public. Right? It can be a test net for the community, which then you don't have as much control over. Whereas a private net you run for yourself or for you and your programming
how do you,
on the re-platform.
So how is a private net set up?
It's an instance essentially, right? And again, if you use the blockchain dev toolkit, we have built a private net instance, which gives you the knobs, the bells and whistles to do what you want to do as a developer writing and testing code without giving you all the constraints of the test net, right? The test net is a clone of a main net for usually. For all
and is that available? Is that available for anybody to use? Is that what I heard
certainly,
you say?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I'll put my email on this, hang on, and then why don't you just ping me and I'll send you a few links. I'll give you my email address here.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I want to take another quick question before we run out of time. So the topic of CBDCs and the digital dollar is way out there. And depending on who you talk to, the privacy folks are like, this sounds terrible. It's going to put us into the world of, Chinese yuan, and we're going to have this, super, big brother out there. And then other folks are saying like, hey, for the US dollar to remain dominant in the world, we're going to have to take on this technology and become a digitally native dollar. But on all that, a digitally native dollar or a digital dollar or the CBDC, all of it revolves code, and it's basically software. And we have folks that are not software knowledgeable, not developers, not engineers, arguing conceptually about this thing called the CBDC or digital dollar. But we need actually more technologists to worry about it and be watching what's actually being written in to the code and the software that will eventually become the CBDC or the digital dollar. I guess, can you just digress for 5 minutes and talk to us about that, and what can we do to activate more engineers and developers to kind of fact check and put some checks and balances into what's going to be happening and unrolling over the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years on this front, and to CBDC or not CBDC. And I'm actually doing an RFI right now from the Federal Reserve on the CBDC, and so would love some insights on that.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. It's a topic very close to my heart. By the way, I've published a few articles on this topic as well. So if you look me up, you can probably find some articles. I'll say a few things, and thank you for the opportunity, Arry. Firstly, I would say today the dollar is digital. The euro is digital. So that's not the big shift. The big shift with the CBDC is me. I am directly holding essentially a liability of the central bank directly. That's the difference, right? Today, you have a lot of banking layers between me, you, the consumer, and the central bank. CBDC, you don't, number one. That's the key difference. I have a direct, and so you can assume that the existing big banks are not going to be happy with it. So watch that space. They're going to push very hard to be in the middle. Number two, if I hold a liability of a central bank directly, then you can imagine the kind of data, the insights they can mine, because they know exactly what all of us are doing, right? So today, you want to track inflation, it takes weeks, months after the fact, and they fudge it and they massage it, right? With a CBDC in near real time, you know exactly where the spend is going, right? You change interest rates and you can see it right away, right? Powerful tools, but incredibly dangerous, right?
Yeah.
And number three, there's a privacy issue, which is where your point, Arry, comes in as technology people, as engineers, developers, and as business entrepreneurs. The implications in terms of privacy, I think, are very interesting. This is a this is the genie right in the bottle, and the genie's out. There's not going to be any stopping. So if there's one thing we could do collectively, I would say, please, do spend some time looking to understand the implications of privacy, or the lack of, and what might we do to ensure that it's a system that balances the needs of the government, obviously, the state, and the needs of us as taxpayers, and find a good middle, right? And if you have a time, look me up. I have a few articles on this thing, and then draw your own conclusions.
Yeah.
It's a political topic. I know I want to be careful, so draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, it's a political topic, but I think, we do need the technology sector watching and advising and being a resource to whatever is going to be eventually implemented, because I don't think we're not going to not do it.
Yes.
But it's software, right? It's code.
Yes.
And so if we can watch and, be the voice of reason and discussing what's actually being implemented versus what's being said is implemented is going to be also important to this process.
Absolutely. I want to add just one more thing, if I may. The interesting piece also about CBDCs is, in a world of CBDCs, there will be a long tail of CBDCs, meaning there will be winners and losers. Because if I can directly hold a liability of the central bank, we can hold a variety of CBDCs the same way you hold crypto today. Right. So there will be a convergence. There will be a fight, a competition, right? And so you can imagine what that means for the powerful central banks and the not so powerful central banks. That's going to be a very interesting game over there, and a very long tail. There are going to be many central banks that will lose in a very big way, unfortunately.
Yeah. I've been reading a lot of books by Peter Zeihan recently, and the idea of like globalization is over. We're going to go back to our own local centric views, become a little more decentralized. No longer we don't know if this is really going to happen, but no longer the companies of 100,000 employees, but more the companies of 30 to 50 folks. And maybe like this idea of central CBDCs will lead to, many hundreds of thousands of digital currencies representing different locales. And, who knows what that'll look like, but it's a crazy future that's ahead of us.
Very true. But think about it. Think about CBDCs competing with each other, right? That's going to be the reality, which is today is hard to imagine that, isn't it?
Yeah, crazy. So we're up at about time. I guess, John, what any last words of advice and thoughts, and what's the best way for people to keep in touch or track you or follow you?
Thank you. First of all, I want to just thank you, Arry, for the opportunity. Thank you, for being on this call and for the discussion and for the questions. I really like the questions. Thank you for pushing on that one. Advice is a very big word. I don't want to say advice. I just want to say, if you have passion for this space, right, push. There is so much yet to be there's so much undiscovered space, right? There's so much here to do. This is just the beginning. I was working on cloud 12 years ago, 13 years ago, right? And I can see the journey, and I'm thinking, we are right now with the blockchain where the cloud was maybe about 10 years ago, right? So think about the possibility, think about the scope, the potential. There's so much. And if anybody says it's done, not even close, right? That's the one thing I would say. And the last thing again is, look at the code, read the code. There's still so much friction, if you will, and sometimes I think self-imposed, perhaps, if I could say it politely. But just go look at it, read it. It'll take some time, and eventually it's like learning a new language. You'll pick it up. You'll be able to read it, And you don't necessarily have to write code. You can find people, you can partner with people who can write code. And if you're a developer, I would say that, but the other thing is look beyond the technology infrastructure, look at the economic protocols baked in. And how do you as a developer exploit those economic protocols? Because otherwise, you at best seeing half the coin, right? That's what I would say. But thank you.
Cool. And then best way to follow you, is it Twitter, email, LinkedIn?
Yes, certainly. I mean, you can look me up. Send me email. I mean, if you want to connect, email is always good, or you can ping me on Twitter as well. I think I put my email on the chat window. Ping me if you have questions. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to give any pointers. And like I said, happy to meet up also sometime. We're all in the Northwest. I'm sure we'll meet in person. So yeah, ping me an email. It's on the site, window. Oh, thank you, Carlos. Good to see you, Carlos.
Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us this Friday afternoon. It's always great to see you, and I always learn so much whenever we chat. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Thank you to the community for joining us and asking some great questions. Keep building, keep learning, keep reading that code, and let's keep moving forward onward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good Friday.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, John.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Friday. Happy every Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday. Thank you, John.
All right. Welcome to Windshield Time, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is non-technical, fun, informative way to learn about money, Bitcoin, blockchains, crypto, and digital assets for busy parents and working folks who are curious about these new technologies. Day, Arry, and their guests talk about these evolutionary systems of money and what they do, y'all. Because what part of your life does money not touch? This podcast is not financial advice, and your reactions are your total and complete responsibility, y'all. Now, thanks again, and enjoy the show.
What are you doing?
Stuck inside.